She was the woman who had it all.
She loved what she did. She loved her husband. She loved her children.
So why would she disappear without a trace?
It wasn't like her to just up and walk away.
I had that gut feeling something's wrong.
There's some type of foul play going on.
As police search for the truth, rumors swirl about betrayals and lies.
They did work together.
There's a whole lot more to this story. The jealousy just built more and more.
The whole thing is strange and convoluted.
And each twist is more shocking than the last.
They were following him.
His tires have been slashed.
His home was firebombed.
You just don't think things like this happen to people?
It became an all-in-all war.
September 6th, 2016, Memphis, Tennessee. It's a typical Friday morning in Hickory Hill, a comfortable suburban community on the southeastern edge of the city.
It's middle class, upper middle class type neighborhood. Almost completely residential.
It's a great area, especially for the kids. You can raise your family, go to church. Schools are exceptional.
But for one Memphis family, this morning will be anything but ordinary. At 7 a.m., Hickory Hill homeowner Randall Freeman places a panicked call to 911.
911, where's emergency?
This is my wife.
Randall reported her missing.
Randall explains that when he woke up moments ago, he was surprised to see that his wife Kayla wasn't in bed beside him.
He walks around the house looking for her.
Kayla!
He still couldn't find her. She's not in the house at all. Randall goes into the garage. He sees the car.
He notices that the garage door is up.
And the driver's side door of Kayla's car is open.
Her keys in ignition.
Her purse is on the ground, and he knows this isn't right. Randall had a sinking feeling his wife is in danger.
She's gone. Somebody took her.
Memphis native Kayla Ashford was initially quiet and reserved around strangers.
She was very shy, very polite.
But it was never long before her warm and friendly nature would come shining through.
Once you became comfortable around her, her personality opened up. Once you got her to smile or laugh, she was your friend, pretty much. When she laughed, everyone laughed, because it was just that infectious. She just lit up the whole room. She just was a likable person. She had lots of friends.
But for all her friends, Kayla felt most at home with her family.
She was always around her family. She was very family-oriented. We're very close. If you saw one of us at Mom's house, you saw the other. We like to travel, so we would always be planning our next adventure. She was always looking for tickets somewhere or take a girls trip. She just really loved traveling.
Kayla had inevitably earned the time off, too. Her love of travel was tempered by a strong work ethic.
Her family, they're driven people. My mom is an educator, so of course schoolwork came first. My family pushes us to do bigger and better things.
For Kayla, a career in social work was the perfect fit.
She was assisting individuals that were on probation, just making sure that individuals were staying off of drugs, making sure they were where they were supposed to be, keeping up with the schedules that were given to them, finding job placement and all of that good stuff. She absolutely loved the type of work she did, the people she worked with. She really loved that job.
But the real love of her life was a man named Randall Freeman. The pair were high school sweethearts who married in 2012.
They went to middle school together. But as far as dating, it became serious maybe around end of freshman year.
He was a familiar face. She felt comfortable around him.
They also had a lot in common.
He was kind of quiet, kind of reserved.
And just like Kayla, Randall worked hard.
He had a good job.
He was in construction. The company that he worked with worked on housing projects. They were building up the neighborhood in Binghamton.
They were trying to redevelop this neighborhood a little bit at a time.
So he did a lot of hands-on work.
Over more than 12 years together, Kayla and Randall forged a strong bond.
I love you, baby.
I love you too. He seemed like a great guy. I was extremely happy for her.
They also had 2 beautiful children.
They both were really excited about the birth of their children.
Motherhood was just awesome for her. She just enjoyed every minute of it.
When she became a mom, it really brought a lot of joy to her. She was definitely involved. She absolutely wanted the best for her children. She's striving to do better for her life and for her family.
By all accounts, the Freemans had built the perfect family. But on the morning of September 6th, 2016, an ominous scene emerges from within the Freeman home.
Randall had just called 911 and reported that his wife was missing and possibly abducted.
I don't know, she just gone. Somebody took her.
When officers respond to Randall's 911 call, the evidence suggests he may be right.
The police arrived and they started looking around and trying to figure out, okay, the keys are here, the purse is here, the car is here.
All her credit cards, driver's license, everything is there in the purse. But her phone is missing. All these things raise the alarm bells significantly.
But does that mean she's been kidnapped?
There was no sign that anybody had forced their way into the home, that there had been a struggle inside the car.
However, just outside the door, separating the garage from the rest of the house, the officers make a chilling discovery.
Kayla's pants are on the floor of the garage.
That immediately made police think that there was some type of foul play.
It's possibly a sexually motivated crime.
Oh my God!
In the fall of 2016, 29-year-old Kayla Freeman was living her best life.
Kayla had a great career, had been married to her husband Randall for 3 years, and had 2 beautiful children.
She loved her family. She was happy with her life.
But on the morning of September 6th, Randall calls the Memphis police and reports that Kayla has disappeared.
Her car is in the garage with the keys in the ignition.
He finds her purse and then her pants on the ground.
They began to wonder, was this a sexual abduction?
Although there's no body, there's no blood, there's no true evidence of foul play, police go ahead and call in the homicide division.
Major crimes, we have a possible abduction.
When homicide detectives arrive on scene, getting information from Randall is their top priority.
When Randall reported her missing, he didn't provide a lot of details.
Can you tell me a little more about what took place here last night?
He was initially distraught.
He didn't give any indication of what could have happened.
Sir, I know this is very difficult, but if there's anything that you could remember right now that you can share with us, it would really help us out.
Kayla went out with some friends, some people from work.
Randall tells police that she had got home pretty late. He had already gone to bed for the evening. and he heard her car pull in, but she didn't immediately come in the house.
Randall tells police that after hearing Kayla's car pull into the garage, he'd rolled over and soon dozed off again.
It was a little before 7 when I woke up and I realized she wasn't there. Kayla.
That's when he started looking for her and finds her car, her purse, the keys, and everything.
Could Kayla's disappearance be an abduction or worse? Randall's statement raises red flags for detectives.
I feared the worst from the very beginning. It's highly unusual for a mother to leave 2 young children.
She's in love with her children. She would never leave them.
Which, of course, brought detectives to their next question.
Were you and Kayla having any kind of problems?
No, not really. We argue sometimes, same as anyone.
Did any of those arguments ever turn physical?
No, I would never hurt Kayla.
Randall stated that he loved his wife very much.
Randall also doesn't hesitate when detectives ask if they can search his van and the rest of the house.
He's very cooperative. He wants to do everything he can to help the investigators find his wife.
After Randall wakes the children and drives them to a relative's house, detectives search the couple's home for clues.
It's just an average house in terms of the normal, everyday things.
Randall's van also appears clean.
We didn't see any signs of blood in his vehicle.
It was just frustrating because we really had no clue as to where she could be.
But just as detectives appear at an impasse, the case takes a startling turn.
Who lives here?
I'm sorry?
I want to report whoever owns this van.
This random man begins yelling and screaming.
He just happened to show up in the middle of all this. It's very odd.
The police calm him down, and he tells them that his name is Clayton James and that he lived a couple of blocks over.
According to Clayton, he'd stopped because he'd spotted Randall's van, which is still parked in the driveway in front of the Freeman's house.
He claims that this van has been stalking him.
It's been following me around for a week.
He had seen this van before. It was distinctive.
He wanted to know who that van belonged to.
When detectives tell him, Clayton appears to draw a blank.
I don't know, Randall.
But Clayton knew Kayla.
Yeah, I know.
She had gone to high school with this guy, and they actually were co-workers for a little while.
But he said he did not know that Kayla lived there.
Clayton claims to not know she's missing either.
When detectives tell Clayton about what's happened with Kayla, he's shocked.
Last night?
Yes.
Wow.
But is his reaction genuine? Detectives aren't so sure.
It's too coincidental that he just so happens to live down the street.
When was the last time you spoke to Kayla?
It's been a while.
He says he hadn't talked to her in over 2 years.
You think that her husband is following you?
Yeah.
Any idea why?
No clue.
He didn't realize at the time that it was a person married to someone he knew. He just knew this guy's messing with him.
Clayton assures detectives he'll let them know if he hears anything from Kayla.
They let him go for now, but the police are really concerned that he just so happens to show up at the house during the investigation.
Hoping for more information, the detectives reach out to Kayla's family, who are racked with worry.
We've already talked to Randall, and we got the news out that Kayla is missing.
No one can find her. She's not answering my phone calls. She's not answering my texts.
They were actively looking for her themselves.
I was still trying to piece things together. I just really couldn't believe that I have a missing sister.
Did she have any problems, enemies?
Everyone loved Kayla.
There's no one that even came to mind.
The family also doubts that Randall would have hurt Kayla.
I honestly didn't see anything that was just like a red flag or anything out of the ordinary.
Randall was looked at as a pretty good guy, a pretty decent man.
And most of all, the family's adamant that Kayla would never have strayed from her marriage.
Kayla was very faithful to her husband. She was focused on her family.
Most of what we got from the family during this initial investigation was responsible and reasonable and very stable person, devoted mother.
But could there be more to Kayla than she had been letting on?
She may not tell the family everything. We had to start digging a little bit more.
And when detectives begin reaching out to Kayla's friends, it's exactly as they suspected. Kayla has been hiding something.
It's discovered that Kayla and Randall's relationship wasn't always rosy.
I would say as of the last 6 months of her marriage, she started sharing some of the problems that they were having.
Kayla's getting a little frustrated with the marriage. She may be getting ready to leave Randall.
But it's Kayla's reason for leaving that really floors the detectives.
Randall was having an affair.
Less than 48 hours after Kayla Freeman disappeared from her suburban Memphis home, detectives have learned that Kayla's relationship with her husband Randall wasn't all that it appeared to be.
Randall had actually been having an affair.
So this whole picket fence, happy family scenario seems to be wiped off in the wash.
News of the affair makes detectives want to take a closer look at Randall.
They realized that Randall wasn't telling the 100% truth the first time that they spoke with him. And they really want to press him for more information.
However, detectives also want to talk to the third member of the alleged love triangle, a woman Kayla's friends identify as 27-year-old Claire Parks.
According to Kayla's friends, she had recently confronted Claire about her affair with Randall.
Kayla and Claire had had words about it, but it never became violent.
On Monday morning, September 9th, detectives bring Claire down to the station for an interview, and she is very upfront about her relationship with Randall.
It was nothing serious. We were just kind of messing around.
Claire states that yes, she and Randall had been having a good time, and that was all it was to either of them, just a fling.
She informs officers that she had no intentions on trying to break up a happy home.
But Kayla found out.
Yeah, and she was pretty upset.
Her and Kayla had had words a couple times, but it was nothing that rose to the level of her wanting to harm Kayla. And she told police that the night that all of this happened, she was at home with her kids.
Obviously, we want to make sure we really confirm anything she says.
Detectives will also need to check up on what Claire says next.
While Claire is admitting about the affair, she goes on to drop another bombshell.
I don't even know why she's mad at me and Randall, though. She has no room to talk.
Claire brings up the fact that Kayla has been having an affair.
Are you sure?
Yeah, that's what Randall said.
He apparently was able to get into her phone, seeing messages and things of that nature.
According to Claire, Randall not only suspected Kayla was having an affair, he also knew the identity of her lover.
The man's named Clayton James.
Clayton was the guy who showed up at Kayla's house the morning she disappeared and claimed that Randall had been following him.
He told the police that he had no idea that she was missing or anything of that nature, that he was driving through that neighborhood and stumbled upon the van.
Now detectives are wondering, was it all a lie?
The whole thing is now much more strange and convoluted.
That afternoon, Detectives bring Clayton down to the station and press him about the alleged affair.
You're not doing anybody any justice if you don't go down that rabbit hole. You have to check all these possibilities.
Clayton denies everything.
He swears and swears and swears that he's never had any type of relationship with her in any way. He said, I've never even hugged her before.
He insisted to officers that he was a happily married man.
And you didn't have anything to do with her disappearance?
No, of course not. I was at home all night.
Clayton's alibi is that he was at home with his wife and children.
And your wife, she'll back you.
Once Clayton realizes that officers are intending to speak with his wife, he becomes extremely nervous.
Clayton's not wanting to have the officers verify his alibi with his wife raises a red flag.
They're concerned that Clayton might be hiding something, and that makes them more suspicious.
It kind of brings to the detective's mind, what would Clayton do to keep someone from making these allegations to his wife?
When detectives follow up with Clayton's wife, Rachel, she appears completely in the dark about Kayla Freeman.
What's going on? Why am I here?
She's really confused as to why police are talking to her.
She's completely unaware of what the allegations are concerning her husband and Kayla.
Do you recognize the name Kayla Freeman?
No.
She doesn't know who this woman is. She doesn't know about an affair.
However, Rachel says that she does know one thing.
She tells police that she knows her husband. He's not a violent man. He's not gonna do anything to hurt anybody, even if he was having an affair.
Rachel also confirms Clayton's alibi.
There's no way that Clayton had anything to do with that woman or her disappearance. He was at home with me all night.
Rachel tells detectives the same thing that Clayton said before, that he had been home with her as well as the kids all night.
But does that mean Clayton's alibi is as airtight as it sounds?
Since Clayton only lived a few blocks from Kayla, it's possible he could have slipped out in the middle of the night while Rachel and the kids were asleep.
Hoping to determine if there really was something going on between Clayton and Kayla, detectives subpoena her cell phone records.
Maybe there was some type of relationship, some kind of contact. We have to check and make certain.
However, detectives are still waiting on the records when the investigation takes another unexpected twist.
Detective Mullins.
They get a tip from Randall's boss, who says that the day after Kayla's disappearance, Randall showed up to work extra early before anyone else.
Randall's boss says he didn't think anything of it at the time, but that was before he found out that Kayla had gone missing.
That was the day that they were supposed to lay the concrete slab for the house that they were building. When everyone arrived at work, Randall had already laid the entire slab by himself.
Randall's boss shares with the detectives a horrific suspicion.
He believes that he knows where Kayla is buried.
Less than a week after Kayla Freeman disappeared, detectives working the case have just received a suspicious tip about her husband, Randall.
According to his foreman, Randall had come into the construction site early the morning after she disappeared and poured a concrete slab all by himself.
Maybe Randall showed up to work early that day to lay the slab by himself so that he could bury Kayla's body under it.
Detectives move quickly to act on the foreman's tip.
They have to secure a warrant to dig up that concrete slab.
While waiting for a judge to sign off on the search warrant, the detectives haul Randall in for questioning.
This time, they're playing hardball with him. They're letting him know that, yes, he is the suspect.
Why didn't you tell us you were cheating on Kayla?
They confront him with the information about the affair with Claire Parks, and he admits it. He says, yeah, he was having an affair with Claire, but that Kayla was having a relationship with Clayton as well.
She was hooking up with him.
Are you sure?
I know it.
He seemed a bit jealous, unstable, maybe paranoid about Kayla and her actions.
Randall's rage and his jealousy made police really become more and more suspicious.
He said things started becoming much more tense between them. They had had more arguments. There was a lot of accusations.
According to Randall, the simmering tensions had boiled over on the night Kayla disappeared.
He admits that there's more to the story, and he had left out a few things.
Randall says that when he'd heard Kayla pull into the garage, he hadn't simply rolled over and gone back to sleep.
Randall states that he did go out and confront her.
Kayla, where you been?
I told you, friends from work.
Don't lie to me.
He was paranoid at that point that she had been with Clayton, and they began arguing.
With your friends all day this week?
We've had this conversation, Randall.
To detectives, it sounded like Randall was working his way towards a confession.
Did you hit her?
What? No!
Randall claimed that he'd said his piece to Kayla and then stormed back inside.
They had a large fight, and she stayed in her car so that she could just ease her mind.
And she never came inside the house?
No, I waited, but she never came to bed.
According to Randall, he'd eventually drifted off to sleep.
He said, when I woke up, she was gone.
Naturally, detectives were more than a little skeptical of Randall's story.
You're not sure which part to believe, if any.
But do detectives know how the story really ends?
If we go dig up that concrete slab you poured, are we gonna find Kayla underneath it?
No, that's crazy.
He tells investigators he couldn't sleep, and instead of just sitting around the house pacing, he decided to go to work and get a jump start on things. Try to get his mind off of the possibility that something really bad might have happened to his wife.
Is Randall telling the truth?
Okay, you're free to go.
There's one way to find out.
By now, the judge had signed the search warrant.
From the station, detectives head out to the construction site, where a crew is already waiting.
A private contractor that does ground-penetrating radar work offered to come out. And sure enough, we have an anomaly. It's about 5 feet long, about 4 feet wide, about 2 to 4 feet deep. And that would be perfect for a body.
Now all detectives need to do is dig up the slab.
We got the city's general services to provide us a bobcat out there with a jackhammer to help us bust up the slab.
Even with heavy equipment, it's hours of back-breaking work.
This is a concrete slab for the foundation of a house. It's a pretty good size area, and we ended up busting up the entire slab, sifting through all the rubble.
Detectives are hopeful and excited that they will solve this case.
They were really optimistic that once they dug up the concrete slab, they would find Kayla.
There's a lot of hope. The news was there. Drones, cameras, everything.
But at the end of their search, the detectives come up empty-handed.
Although there was an anomaly, there was no body.
They didn't find Kayla. They didn't find any evidence of a crime.
We were there all day, literally all day, and came up with nothing.
It appeared that Randall was telling the truth.
And detectives are back to square one.
They didn't know where Kayla was or what happened to her.
But just as Kayla's trail appears to be going cold, the investigation into her disappearance takes another bizarre turn.
What?
The detectives are notified by a 911 dispatch, and there is a fire at Clayton James' home.
That was another shocker. I was like, what in the world? You know, like, what is going on?
All right, we'll be right there.
What happened?
Apparently, someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail and set it ablaze.
Detective Mullins.
1 week after Kayla Freeman vanished, police and firefighters have just responded to another urgent 911 call a few blocks away from her suburban Memphis home.
A 911 call comes into dispatch and it's Clayton James reporting that his house is on fire.
This is the guy that Randall has accused Kayla of sleeping with.
Someone has thrown a Molotov cocktail through Clayton's window, and his family had to escape from the house.
Clayton and his family are unharmed, and firefighters are able to extinguish the flames.
But as Clayton informed detectives, this wasn't the first bizarre incident that had occurred since Kayla disappeared.
He said that he'd been receiving text messages, phone messages, threats.
The next morning, detectives review footage from surveillance cameras Clayton had recently installed on his home.
When the police went through the surveillance footage, not only did they see someone throwing the firebomb, they saw who threw it.
The person firebombing the house is indeed Randall Freeman. You can see his face clearly, even at night.
After viewing the video footage, police immediately secure an arrest warrant for Randall Freeman for arson.
It doesn't really matter if the house burns to the ground, partially burns, or just has a little bit of damage from this arson. It's all the same.
The news of Randall's arrest floors Kayla's family.
My sister's missing, and you're setting other people's house on fire. How does this connect? And what is really going on?
Randall is committing arson against the person he believes that Kayla is sleeping with. That just made things worse, in terms of our suspicions.
But given the timing, Randall's motive remains unclear.
Did Randall do this because of the affair? Or did he do this because he began to think that Clayton was behind the disappearance?
Detectives are wondering if Randall is seeking vigilante justice.
Only Randall knows for sure, but he's done talking.
After he went to jail, he quit cooperating with us. He pretty much just asked for an attorney and wouldn't talk about it.
With Randall in jail on the arson charge, detectives turn their focus to Clayton James, who denied having an affair with Kayla.
You have to wonder, is Randall really paranoid and suspicious, or is he on the right track? Is she actually having an affair with this person?
But when detectives received Kayla's phone records, it appeared Clayton was telling the truth.
We couldn't establish any kind of real contact between them. And at the time of Kayla's disappearance, it didn't appear they were making any contact at all.
There was never any evidence of a relationship other than a friendship between Clayton and Kayla.
When detectives follow up with Kayla's family and friends, they also dismiss Randall's allegation that she had cheated.
Kayla was very faithful to her husband. She never, ever mentioned anything about another man because there was no man.
That was just a slap in our face to even say something like that.
But if that was the case, why did Randall seem so convinced that Kayla and Clayton were having an affair?
I'm not sure what made him think this.
His obsession with Clayton James really stuck out to me even after Kayla was gone, he's still chasing after this man.
But does that mean Randall had also done something to Kayla?
For me, it's all funneling down to this is going to be a murder.
The question is, can detectives prove it?
They don't have any way to connect him to the disappearance of his wife.
We don't really have a witness that can say, you know, I saw somebody dragging a body out of a car. I saw somebody digging on the side of the road, or I saw someone on a bridge throwing something in a creek. We don't have that kind of an eyewitness. And even the evidence that we do have is not really significant enough to say this proves it's a homicide.
Also, the homicide detectives do not have a body.
We don't even know if she's dead, technically. Even if we believe it, we don't know it. So in a way, we're missing everything.
Still, the detectives refuse to give up.
We never quit. We're not going to stop until we get all the answers that we can get and find those responsible and put them where they need to be.
Detectives spend long hours searching for Kayla's body.
We look at the satellite images of the area. We see there's wooded areas, there's bodies of water. We started trying to do some systematic searching of those areas.
All of their search has come up empty.
Weeks pass as Kayla's friends and family become more and more desperate to find her.
We did the flyers. Of course, it was on the news. It was on social media.
They put up a $15,000 cash reward, hoping that someone will come forward with information.
But after 2 agonizing months with no new information and no word from Kayla, even her family faces the grim possibility that she's never coming home.
Around Thanksgiving, I had that gut feeling. I don't know if you call it a sixth sense. You just know. But that closure piece was very important.
They just wanted her body.
But will a moment of indiscretion finally give Kayla's family the closure they crave?
After more than a year of no new information and no leads on the case, the police get a tip from a jailhouse snitch.
Apparently, Randy is talking in jail.
By December 2017, Randall Freeman has spent more than a year in jail awaiting trial on arson charges.
He was arrested for firebombing the home of Clayton James, the man he believed had been sleeping with his wife, Kayla.
He can't get out of jail. The bond is too high. We've got a very, very good case on Randall Freeman for the arson.
But will detectives ever be able to close the books on Kayla's disappearance?
Detectives believed Randall killed Kayla and hid her body, but they had no proof.
However, after months of dead ends, detectives receive what appears to be a promising tip from an inmate at the Shelby County Jail.
An inmate housed with Randall Freeman tells detectives that Randall confessed that he had killed Kayla.
These little tidbits that we get from jail conversation, things of that nature, is enough to keep us going.
But it's not enough to bring murder charges against Randall.
A skilled defense attorney will rip the case apart if the only thing that they have is a jailhouse snitch.
Although with his trial on the arson charges approaching, prosecutors believe they have some powerful leverage.
Since Clayton and his family were home when Randall firebombed the house, he was also charged with multiple counts of aggravated assault and attempted murder.
He is facing so much time with these charges that if convicted is well over 100 years.
Will Randall be willing to lead detectives to Kayla's body in order to shave off some prison time?
What we want from him is real simple. Where's your wife? What happened to your wife? You tell us that, and we'll talk about whatever plea bargains we can reasonably work out.
Kayla's family agrees to the plan.
They shared it with us about the plea, and we wanted to move forward with doing that.
Whatever they have to do in order to get a confession so that they can get Kayla's body back, they're willing to go with it.
It was something that we needed as a family to actually put her to rest.
Now, it all depends on Randall.
The prosecution confront Randall, and they bargain with him to get him a deal so that they would give him only 28 years just to get the body.
His back against the wall, Randall accepts the prosecutor's offer.
If he doesn't, he'll be buried under the jail. Now, he knows that at some point in time, he'll see the light of day.
Randall tells police that he hid the body in a creek not too far from the home.
Searching the area, detectives find human remains.
The body was completely decomposed. It had been out there for over a year, exposed to the elements. But in this case, we were able to confirm that it was Kayla through dental x-rays.
It was sort of a relief in a way that we could actually put her to rest and that my family had closure.
Despite the state of Kayla's remains, the medical examiner suggests a possible cause of death.
Regardless of whether there's skin or not, we do have forensic anthropologists that can examine the remains, and we found blunt force trauma, but there was not enough evidence to suggest he beat her to death, although he could have. And unless he tells us specifically, and he didn't, we'll probably never know exactly what happened.
But detectives believe at least some of what Randall told them about that night was true.
That night, Kayla went home. Randall confronted her.
Kayla, where you been?
I told you. Friends from work.
Don't lie to me.
He accused her of being out with Clayton.
Kayla, you've been going out every day.
How many times do I have to tell you?
The argument became heated, and Randall lashed out in anger.
Every night with these ladies. You should be home with me.
It's ladies from work.
I think that a physical fight between them just went too far.
After realizing what he'd done, Randall had gotten rid of her body. Then he'd scrambled to cover his tracks.
He staged the scene as though a kidnapping took place, and then proceeded to call 911 and play the role of a grieving husband.
But now, more than a year after he made that call, Randall stands before a judge and admits the truth.
Randall Freeman pled guilty to second-degree murder and aggravated arson and was sentenced to 28 years. He cannot get out till he's done 100% of the time.
Kayla's family would have liked to see him serve more time, but they've made their peace with the outcome.
I forgive him. There's no hate in my heart. He'll serve his time. Hopefully, he'll come out and say something to his children who will be adults when he's released.
The clock struck midnight, but for the city of Silver Creek, time had stood frozen at 1988 for nearly 4 decades. It began with a chill that wasn't just in the autumn air. It was the sensation of a life being severed, a scream swallowed by the heavy, indifferent fog of a November night. A young woman, vibrant and full of promise, had vanished from the edge of the downtown district, leaving behind nothing but a solitary, mud-caked shoe and the lingering scent of ozone and fear. The local headlines from that era, preserved now in crumbling newsprint, screamed of a vanishing act, a phantom predator, and a community plunged into a state of permanent, suffocating paranoia. For 38 years, this was the defining wound of the city, a cold case that sat in the darkest, most inaccessible corner of the precinct's archives, a silent testament to a failure that gnawed at the conscience of every detective who passed through those doors. The streets where she once walked became conduits of urban legend, whispered about in hushed tones by parents to their children, a cautionary tale that refused to die, always lurking beneath the surface of the city's modern, bustling veneer. The investigation in the late 80s was a frantic, uncoordinated sprawl of desperate measures and missed signals. In the absence of modern DNA technology, detectives were forced to rely on the unreliable theater of witness accounts and the sheer, exhausting grind of door-to-door canvassing. They chased ghosts through the alleys, followed leads that led only to dead ends, and watched helplessly as the trail grew colder than the winter ground. The victim's family lived in a state of suspended animation, their lives defined by the absence of an answer, a persistent ache that was refreshed by every passing anniversary. The city, meanwhile, collectively held its breath, waiting for a closure that never came, until the case became a piece of furniture in the collective consciousness, always there, ignored, yet fundamentally changing the layout of the city's heart. The mystery wasn't just about a crime. It was about the chilling realization that a human being could simply cease to exist, snatched from the familiar, safe comfort of her own neighborhood, and that the architect of that horror was somewhere, perhaps even watching, while the city slowly forgot how to look for him. Years bled into decades, and the file became a relic of a time before the digital age, a collection of Polaroid photos, handwritten memos, and typed statements that smelled of stale coffee and cigarettes. The detectives who had originally broken their spirits against the stone wall of this mystery retired, passed away, or were swallowed by the indifference of time. The case was destined to be a permanent unsolved, a statistic in the annals of forgotten crimes. But in the shadows of the precinct, the evidence remained. It was a time capsule of terror, waiting for the technology that hadn't existed when the crime was committed. It was waiting for the revolution of genetic genealogy, for the forensic leaps that would allow the microscopic, discarded fragments left at the scene to finally speak their truth. It was a patient, silent witness, resting in a cardboard box, holding the secret that would eventually dismantle the lie that the killer had built for himself. Then came the shift, a systematic, cold-blooded review of the archives, spurred by a new generation of investigators who refused to accept the finality of the cold label. They moved through the evidence with a clinical, laser-focused precision, treating every fiber and every speck of dust as a potential key. When the match finally arrived, it wasn't a grand, cinematic explosion, but a quiet, digital notification that cascaded through the department like a lightning strike. The DNA profile had aligned. The ghost had a name. The shadow had a face. The realization that the killer was not a stranger, not an ephemeral monster from the woods, but a figure who had been woven into the tapestry of the city for all these years, hit the department with the force of an oncoming train. The investigation that had been frozen for nearly 40 years suddenly ignited, transforming from a stagnant record into a high-octane pursuit that left everyone breathless. The surveillance teams mobilized with a surgical silence that contrasted sharply with the chaotic energy of the original investigation. They watched the suspect as he went through the motions of his mundane, twilight existence, a man of routine, a man of invisibility. They saw the grandfather, the neighbor, the quiet worker, and they saw him through the lens of the monster he had been in 1988. It was a disorienting, visceral experience for the detectives to bridge that gap, to reconcile the man before them with the blood-stained truth of his past. They mapped out his movements, his history, his every connection, building a case that was so ironclad, so suffocatingly precise, that when the time finally came to move in, there would be no room for even a whisper of doubt. It was the culmination of decades of deferred justice, a closing of the loop that had been left open by the technological limitations of a previous century. The arrest itself was a masterstroke of controlled chaos. As the tactical units surrounded the unassuming home, the city didn't know that its longest-running, most painful chapter was about to reach its final, traumatic resolution. When the handcuffs finally clicked shut, the sound was the only punctuation necessary for a story that had been written in tragedy. The suspect, caught in the grip of his own history, was pulled from the quiet, false safety of his home and into the harsh, unflinching light of accountability. For the detectives, this was the zenith, the moment of validation that made every lost hour, every dead lead, and every sleepless night feel like a necessary component of this inevitable end. They had dragged the truth from the dark, and in doing so, they had reclaimed the narrative that had been stolen so long ago. The interrogation room, usually a space for the desperate and the guilty, took on the gravity of a courtroom of history. The detectives laid out the evidence, the sequence of the DNA, the timeline of the night, the crushing, inescapable facts that shattered the man's facade of innocence. He sat there, a portrait of fading arrogance, watching as his life of secrets was dismantled brick by brick. There were no grand declarations, no cinematic confessions, but there was the undeniable, suffocating weight of realization. He had believed he had outrun his own shadow, that he had lived long enough to bury the truth, but the science had proved him wrong. The silence of the room was heavy, filled with the presence of the victim, who had finally been granted the voice she had been denied for nearly 4 decades. As news of the arrest broke, the city of Silver Creek was plunged into a state of shock that transcended simple surprise. It was a seismic shift, a reordering of reality. Neighbors looked at one another with new eyes, wondering how such a secret could have festered in their midst. The arrest wasn't just a police success. It was a communal reckoning. The city was forced to confront the fact that evil is not always a distant, exotic phenomenon. Sometimes it is the person who greets you at the mailbox, the person who shares your street, the person who hides in plain sight while you sleep. The revelation tore through the community, exposing the fragility of their perceived safety and forcing them to re-examine the history they had lived through, thinking they knew the truth, when in reality, they had been living in a curated, murderous lie. The legal proceedings that followed were not merely a trial. They were a collective catharsis, a public airing of the grief and the anger that had been held in suspension for a generation. The courtroom became a crucible where the testimony, the physical evidence, and the reconstructed timeline of that November night were presented with a brutal, unflinching clarity. The jurors sat in a rapt, pained silence, watching as the life of the victim was restored in the eyes of the law, and the life of the killer was exposed as a hollow, fraudulent construct. It was a slow, deliberate process, but it was essential, a way of ensuring that the truth was not just known, but recognized, validated, and finalized by the mechanism of justice. Every word spoken was a stone laid in the construction of a new understanding, a final monument to the memory of the one who had been lost. Yet, even as the verdict was delivered and the case was officially marked as solved, the echoes of the trauma remained. The closure was real, but it was not a cure. The city of Silver Creek had been permanently marked by the events of 1988, and the resolution of the case did not erase the history. It only gave it a period to end the sentence. The victim's family, who had spent decades living in the shadow of the unknown, found themselves navigating a new, difficult terrain of grief, one where the answers provided a strange, heavy peace. The community, too, was left to piece together its own identity in the wake of the revelation. They were a city that had been haunted, and they were a city that had been released, but the memory of the haunting would always remain, a reminder of the darkness that can exist just beneath the surface of the ordinary. In the end, the solution of a 1988 cold case was a victory for science, for persistence, and for the unrelenting demand for justice, but it was also a somber reflection on the nature of time and the fragility of truth. The mystery of the vanishing had been solved, the predator had been unmasked, and the files had been closed, but the city would never truly be the same again. It had lived through the long, dark winter of the unknown, and it had finally emerged into the cold, clear light of the truth. The story of the November night was finally over, but the resonance of it, the pain, the shock, and the final, necessary reckoning would continue to pulse through the streets of Silver Creek, a testament to a life lost, a city haunted, and a mystery that, after all this time, was finally, irrevocably, solved. The case of 1988 was no longer a ghost story. It was a historical reality, and in that transition, the city had finally been allowed to look toward the future, unburdened by the secret that had been choking it for 38 years. The investigative machinery that had churned ineffectively for decades didn't just restart. It evolved into a sophisticated, cold-blooded apparatus of pursuit that dwarfed everything the precinct had known in the 80s. The forensic labs, no longer mere storage lockers for degradation and dust, became the epicenter of a new, high-stakes battleground where the past was being actively mined for secrets. Technicians worked with a religious fervor, their eyes glued to monitors that displayed the molecular fingerprints of a ghost. Every single fiber of the victim's clothing, every scrap of debris recovered from the desolate roadside where she was found, was subjected to a battery of tests that would have seemed like science fiction back in 1988. They were searching for the invisible architecture of a killer, hunting for the sequence of life that had been left behind in a moment of violence. The pressure within the department was palpable, a heavy, electric tension that dictated the rhythm of every heartbeat. They were not just chasing a suspect, they were chasing the legitimacy of their own profession, fighting to prove that time was not an absolute barrier to the reach of the law. The breakthrough, when it hit the lead investigator's desk, was a moment of profound, jarring silence. It was a file marked with a single, irrefutable name, a name that had existed on the periphery of the original investigation but had been discarded as irrelevant, a mere ripple in the chaos of 1,000 different leads. Seeing that name under the new, cold light of genetic confirmation changed everything. It meant the killer had been there, within reach, perhaps even under the gaze of the authorities, all while the city was tearing itself apart in a desperate, futile search for a phantom. The lead investigator felt a coldness creep up his spine that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. It was the realization of how close they had been, and how much damage had been done by the arrogance of early assumptions. The suspect was not a monster who had vanished into the ether. He was a man who had continued to live, to breathe, to walk the streets of Silver Creek, hidden behind the mask of an ordinary, unremarkable life. This realization necessitated a level of tactical planning that bordered on the obsessive. The team spent weeks, days that felt like months, crafting a surveillance plan that would account for every contingency. They were tracking a predator who had successfully evaded detection for 38 years. They could not afford a single mistake. They observed him from unmarked cars, from the periphery of his neighborhood, from the shadows of the city he had terrorized. They watched him interact with his world, and they tried to reconcile the man who played with his grandchildren in the park with the man whose DNA was linked to a horrific act of violence in the autumn of 1988. It was a psychological gauntlet for the detectives, a test of their ability to remain objective while staring into the face of a hidden evil. They had to treat him as a threat, but they also had to understand his rhythm, his habits, the very mundane patterns that had allowed him to blend into the city's background noise for so long. As they tightened the noose, the atmosphere in the precinct became one of controlled, vibrating intensity. Every briefing was a rehearsal for the final act, every tactical meeting a study in anticipation. They were preparing to snatch a man out of his reality and pull him into theirs, a reality that was about to be defined by the weight of a 3-decade-old murder. The detectives found themselves questioning their own perceptions of the city. They looked at the familiar streets of Silver Creek and saw the echoes of the past. They saw the ghosts of the investigation that had failed, and they saw the path that had led them to this, the penultimate moment of reckoning. The anticipation was intoxicating, yet terrifying. They knew that once they triggered the arrest, there would be no turning back, no room for uncertainty. They would have to present a case that would withstand the scrutiny of a new century, built on the foundation of evidence that had once been considered lost to time. The moment the surveillance team got the signal, the transformation of the city was instantaneous, though invisible to the public eye. Units moved into position with the silent, fluid motion of a predatory animal. The suspect, leaving his home for a routine errand, had no idea that the world he had cultivated for 38 years was about to implode. He was moving through his day with the confidence of a man who had won the game, a man who had outsmarted time itself. He didn't see the unmarked cars pulling up behind him. He didn't see the faces of the detectives, faces that had spent months studying watching him, judging him. When the takedown happened, it was swift, decisive, and entirely anticlimactic in its efficiency. One moment, he was a citizen, the next he was a subject, a man in transition from his own self-constructed reality to the cold, stark accountability of the interrogation room. The drive to the precinct was a journey through the heart of the city he had scarred. The suspect sat in the back of the cruiser, silent, his world shrinking down to the interior of the vehicle and the certainty of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. For the detectives in the front, it was the culmination of a career-defining pursuit. They were carrying the weight of 1988 with them. The ghosts of the failed investigators, the tears of the victim's family, and the decades of silence that had finally been broken. They were driving through the very streets where the victim had walked, where the search had stalled, and where the secret had festered. It was a processional of justice, a physical manifestation of the fact that nothing, no amount of time, no depth of secrecy, is ever truly beyond the reach of the law. When they entered the interrogation room, the temperature seemed to drop. The room was sterile, illuminated by the harsh, unflinching light that stripped away the pretense of the suspect's normalcy. He sat at the metal table, a man stripped of his life, facing the men who had dismantled it. The detectives didn't speak at first. They let the silence build, letting him contemplate the walls that were suddenly and irreversibly closing in. They had the evidence in front of them, the files, the photographs, the biological confirmation, and they were ready to dismantle his life piece by piece. They were not looking for a confession. They were looking for a surrender. They were there to present him with a history he had tried to erase, and to see if he could still stand when faced with the mirror of his own past. It was the start of the final interrogation, a dialogue between a man who had lied for 38 years and the people who were finally, officially, calling him to account. The suspect's initial reaction was one of calculated, practiced confusion. He maintained a facade of disbelief, a shell of indifference that had served him well throughout his life. But as the detectives began to unravel the narrative, he could see the cracks in his own story. They spoke about the night of the disappearance with a level of detail that only someone who had been there could appreciate. They traced the path he had taken, the choices he had made, and the moment the life of the victim had been cut short. They were not accusing him. They were describing him. And with every detail they presented, the suspect's world grew smaller. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to press in closer, and the weight of the years began to crush the life out of his denial. It was a slow, methodical execution of a long-held lie, and it was the most professional, the most devastating thing the detectives had ever done. This was not the theatrics of television. This was the raw, exhausting reality of a confrontation that had been overdue by more than a generation. The detectives could see the moment the realization hit him, not a sudden outburst, but a subtle, flickering acknowledgement in his eyes that the jig was up. It was the moment he realized that his life was no longer his own, that it belonged to the file, to the precinct, and to the truth. The detectives remained impassive, their focus narrowed to the task at hand, the extraction of the truth. They watched the man who had been a local figure for decades wither under the pressure of his own history, and they felt a profound sense of closure. They were finishing the work that had been started in 1988, bridging the gap between the past and the present, and ensuring that the victim would finally have her day of reckoning. As the interrogation dragged on into the early hours of the morning, the city of Silver Creek continued to sleep, completely unaware that the tectonic plates of its history were shifting beneath its feet. The detectives worked with a relentless, machine-like focus, driven by the memory of the cold case and the promise they had made to themselves and the families they served. They were documenting the end of the mystery, recording the details of the crime that had defined their precinct for so long. They were building the bridge that would carry the truth from the dark room of the interrogation to the public arena of the courtroom. It was a monumental, grueling effort, but they were fueled by the knowledge that this was the final act, the last stand against the darkness that had dominated Silver Creek for nearly 4 decades. When they finally emerged from the interrogation room, the sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, casting a long, pale light over the city. The lead investigator looked at his team, their faces drawn and weary, but their eyes shining with a quiet, profound satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. They had not just solved a case, they had reclaimed a piece of the city's soul. They had looked into the dark and they had found the truth, and they had brought it back with them, into the light. It was the end of the mystery, but it was just the beginning of the legal process, a process that would hold the suspect accountable for the life he had stolen and for the decades of silence he had imposed on the city of Silver Creek. The case was no longer a cold file. It was an active, breathing reality, a beacon of truth that would illuminate the path forward for the justice system and for the community that had waited for so long to finally say the words out loud. The 1988 case was solved. This transition from the private, grueling reality of the investigation to the public, explosive impact of the arrest would be the next phase, one that would redefine Silver Creek once and for all. The detectives walked to their cars in the cool, crisp air of the morning, the weight of the last few months suddenly lifting, replaced by a strange, hollow feeling of accomplishment. They had done it. They had done what everyone said was impossible. They had chased a ghost for nearly 40 years, and they had finally, through a combination of science and sheer, bull-headed persistence, caught it. They headed home, leaving behind the files that would soon be used to build a case that would echo through the city, the state, and the annals of true crime history. The investigation was over, but the story of the 1988 cold case, now solved, was just beginning to find its final, definitive form. The morning after the arrest, the silence in Silver Creek felt different. No longer the heavy, stagnant air of an unsolved mystery, but a taut, electric atmosphere that signaled the beginning of a total societal upheaval. As the news broke, first in the local digital outlets and then with the relentless, invasive reach of the national press, the city found itself transformed into the epicenter of a historic reckoning. The name of the suspect, once so thoroughly integrated into the mundane fabric of the community, was now plastered across every screen, his image juxtaposed with a faded, grainy photo of the 1988 victim. The reaction was not merely one of news cycle interest. It was a visceral, communal tremor. People stopped in the streets, sat in stunned silence in coffee shops, and gathered in tight clusters to process the impossible. The monster had been one of them, living behind a wall of invisibility that they had collectively helped to build by simply not looking closer. The precinct became a fortress of activity. The detectives, having finally transitioned from the hunt to the preparation of the trial, found their office besieged by media requests, legal inquiries, and the overwhelming, emotional presence of the public. They had to navigate a landscape that was now heavily saturated with the trauma of the past. The families of the victim, who had lived for years in the quiet, desperate hope for a breakthrough, were suddenly thrust into the center of a media storm. Their grief, which had been private and manageable, was now public property, a spectacle that they had to manage while still processing the fact that the person who had stolen their loved one was finally in custody. It was a cruel, yet necessary, price of the closure they had demanded for so long. The detectives, acting as a shield, tried to insulate them as much as possible, focusing their own energy on the meticulous assembly of the prosecution's case. Every scrap of physical evidence, every digital forensic log, and every statement gathered during the interrogation was now a pillar of a structure that would soon be presented to a jury. The prosecution team, a group of seasoned attorneys who understood the magnitude of this moment, worked around the clock, their eyes bloodshot, their focus razor-sharp. They were not just trying a man for a murder. They were trying a man for a generation of silence. The legal theory was complex, threading together the past and the present with a narrative that had to be both scientifically airtight and emotionally resonant. They were building a case that would bridge the gap between 1988 and 2026, forcing a jury to see through the fog of time to the clarity of the act itself. It was a chess game played with the lives of people, and every piece they moved had to be positioned with the utmost strategic foresight. Meanwhile, the city of Silver Creek began its own painful, introspective process. Town hall meetings were convened, though they were less about the logistics of the case and more about the existential crisis the arrest had triggered. Citizens stood up to speak, not to the police, but to each other, about the failure of the community to identify the predator who had walked among them. They talked about the culture of looking away, about the way they had allowed themselves to be blinded by the suspect's benign facade, and about the deep-seated, collective guilt that had begun to emerge now that the truth was unavoidable. It was an uncomfortable, bracing exercise in self-examination, a communal therapy session that was essential to the city's long-term health. The arrest had ripped the scab off a wound that had never properly healed, and now, the city was forced to finally address the infection that had been hiding beneath. The suspect, now incarcerated, occupied a strange, isolated space in the judicial system. He was the most hated man in the city, the embodiment of the fear that had defined their past, yet he was also, in a legal sense, a man whose constitutional rights were being carefully guarded by the very system he had once tried to subvert. The irony was not lost on the detectives. They watched as his defense team, well-funded and strategically savvy, began to pick apart the procedural details, looking for any inconsistency, any weakness in the chain of evidence. It was a reminder that the path to justice is rarely a straight line, and that the fight for conviction was far from over. The defense focused on the degradation of the evidence, the fallibility of human memory after nearly 40 years, and the potential for technological misinterpretation, every argument designed to sow the seeds of doubt in a jury that would have no first-hand experience with the reality of 1988. The forensic team, despite the success of the initial match, now faced the daunting task of verifying and re-verifying every aspect of their findings. They were the front line of the scientific challenge, performing additional tests, consulting with independent experts, and preparing to defend their work under the harsh, adversarial glare of cross-examination. They were no longer just running experiments. They were preparing to testify as to the fundamental nature of reality itself. Every time they looked at the DNA sequence, they saw not just data, but the final, indisputable proof of the killer's guilt, and their mission was to translate that technical certainty into the plain, simple language that a jury could understand and believe. It was a rigorous, exhausting process, but it was the essential foundation of the case, and they did not falter, knowing that the entire investigation rested on the integrity of their lab results. As the pre-trial phase dragged on, the emotional toll on the community deepened. The case had become a permanent part of the daily conversation, an omnipresent topic that colored everything from school board elections to casual neighborhood gossip. The city was under the microscope, its history being picked apart by outside observers and its wounds being reopened by every new development in the legal proceedings. Yet through this, there was a sense of purpose emerging. Silver Creek was no longer defined by the mystery of the vanishing woman. It was defined by its response to the truth. The citizens began to organize, creating support networks for families of cold case victims, hosting events that honored the memory of the victim, and committing themselves to a future where such a secret could never again be buried. They were evolving, finding a new identity in the wake of the revelation. The detectives, seeing this change, felt a profound, bittersweet pride. They had done their part, but the community had taken the burden and transformed it into a commitment to a better, more honest future. They had watched the city move through the stages of shock, denial, and finally, acceptance. The investigation had become a catalyst for a kind of communal maturity that was rare and deeply moving. They realized that their work was about more than just a guilty verdict. It was about the restoration of a moral equilibrium that had been tilted for 38 years. They were the architects of the shift, and the city's response was the most significant, if unintended, outcome of their success. Behind the scenes, the investigators continue to prepare for the trial, their work now governed by the strict, procedural requirements of the court. They reviewed their notes, double-checked their timelines, and refined their testimony, ensuring that they were ready to present the story of the 1988 cold case with a level of clarity that would leave no room for misunderstanding. They knew that the eyes of the city, and perhaps the world, would be on them when they took the stand. The weight of the responsibility was immense, but it was also a badge of honor. They were the ones who had finally unlocked the mystery, and they were the ones who would now deliver the final, definitive narrative of justice. The trial would be the final, public act of the long play that had begun in a fog-shrouded night in 1988, and they were ready for the curtain to rise. As the date for the trial approached, the sense of anticipation in Silver Creek became all-consuming. The city was preparing for a legal proceeding that would be the most significant event in its recent history. Shops and businesses began to organize themselves around the trial schedule. Traffic patterns were adjusted, security measures were heightened, and the entire rhythm of the city seemed to sync with the upcoming proceedings. It was a moment of intense, concentrated gravity. The story of the vanishing had come full circle, moving from the desperate, uncoordinated search of the 80s to the high-tech, precision-engineered pursuit of the modern era, and now, finally, to the courtroom, where the truth would be tested, validated, and enshrined in the record of the law. The 1988 case was no longer a ghost story. It was a reality, a tangible, inescapable history, and the city of Silver Creek was ready to face it, whatever the outcome might be. The silence had been shattered, the truth had been spoken, and the trial was the final, inevitable march toward justice. The courtroom doors swung open with a finality that felt like the closing of a tomb, and as the gallery filled with the hushed, anxious murmur of a city on edge, the trial of the century began. The atmosphere inside was not merely one of legal formality. It was a pressurized, airless environment where history was being dissected under a microscope. The judge, a figure of stoic impartiality, surveyed the room, his presence an anchor in the turbulent sea of emotions that defined the space. The defendant sat at the table, a man who had successfully inhabited the ghost-like existence of an ordinary citizen for decades, now rendered a pariah by the cold, undeniable facts laid out before him. The prosecution's opening statement was a masterclass in narrative tension, a vivid, forensic reconstruction that dragged the jury back to the autumn of 1988, not just as observers, but as witnesses to the erasure of a life. Every word spoken by the lead prosecutor was a brick in the wall of evidence they were constructing. They described the night, the atmosphere, the sudden, violent rupture of a mundane evening, and the methodical way the victim had been stalked and eventually silenced. They did not rely on hyperbole. They relied on the crushing weight of biological certainty. They introduced the genetic markers, the digital breadcrumbs, and the reconstruction of the defendant's movements, a narrative that transformed the suspect from a grandfatherly figure into a predator, piece by agonizing piece. The jury sat in a kind of stunned paralysis, their eyes darting between the photos of the victim's youth and the withered, aged face of the man who had stolen her future. The contrast was brutal, a visual shorthand for the stolen years that could never be reclaimed. When the first witness took the stand, a woman who had been a childhood friend of the victim, now a middle-aged mother grappling with the resurfacing of a trauma she had buried in the depths of her psyche, the courtroom became a place of raw, unflinching vulnerability. Her testimony was not about the crime, but about the absence. She spoke of the empty seat at the dinner table, the silence in the neighborhood, the way the world had tilted on its axis the moment the victim went missing. It was a testimony that humanized the case, moving it beyond the cold, sterile data of the forensic lab and anchoring it in the lived reality of grief. The jurors wept openly, the stoic barriers of their duty momentarily dissolving in the face of the unvarnished pain that had been preserved in ice for nearly 40 years. The cross-examination by the defense was a desperate, surgical attempt to introduce doubt into the pristine architecture of the prosecution's case. They attacked the methodology of the forensic teams, they questioned the chain of custody for the 38-year-old evidence, and they painted the entire investigation as a product of modern bias and technological over-reliance. It was a standard, tactical playbook, yet in the context of the Oakhaven case, it felt like an insult to the reality that everyone in the room now understood. The defense attorneys were fighting for a man who had already been convicted in the court of history. Their arguments felt like echoes in an empty hall. The jurors, however, remained impassive, their attention fixed on the facts, their collective judgment seemingly solidified by the sheer accumulation of proof that the prosecution had meticulously laid out over the preceding days. By the second week, the courtroom had become a microcosm of the city itself. The daily ritual of the trial, the arguments, the rebuttals, the subtle theater of legal strategy, had become the rhythm of life in Silver Creek. Every evening, the news broadcasts would dissect the day's testimony, and every morning, the cycle would begin again with renewed intensity. The detectives who had been the architects of the investigation watched from the back of the room, their expressions a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had done their part, but watching the truth move through the machinery of the law was a process that demanded patience, discipline, and a profound respect for the gravity of the process. They saw how the evidence they had spent months and years gathering was now becoming the bedrock of a moral reckoning, a transformation that felt both inevitable and miraculous. The defendant's own testimony, if it could be called that, was a masterclass in evasion. He spoke in clipped, dry sentences, his voice a drone that lacked the humanity of a man who had just been confronted with the horror of his past. He tried to offer explanations for the presence of his DNA, his proximity to the crime scene, and his own history of violence, excuses that felt thinner with every word he uttered. It was the spectacle of a man trying to weave a tapestry out of smoke, a futile defense against the harsh, bright beam of the truth. His own defense team seemed to shrink away from him as he spoke, their efforts to mitigate the damage clearly faltering under the weight of his own calculated, detached delivery. It was the performance of a man who had long since separated himself from the consequences of his actions, and the jury watched him with a mixture of revulsion and pity. The emotional climax of the trial came when the forensic scientist who had made the initial breakthrough was called to the stand. She was a woman of precise, clinical intelligence, and as she explained the mechanism of the genetic genealogy, the courtroom grew deathly silent. She didn't talk about monsters. She talked about probabilities, about family lineages, about the way that the biological code is an unbreakable, inescapable record of human existence. Her testimony was the final nail in the coffin of the defense's argument, a bridge that connected the perpetrator directly to the scene with a level of accuracy that made any defense appear delusional. She brought the entire case back to its essence, the cold, unyielding reality of biology, a force of nature that had finally, after 3 decades, caught up to the human capacity for cruelty. During the final arguments, the prosecution's voice was the only thing in the room that held any weight. They painted a picture of the life that had been interrupted, the dreams that were never realized, the family that had been permanently shattered, and the city that had been held hostage by a secret for a generation. They spoke about the duty that the living owed to the dead, a debt that could only be paid by the uncompromising pursuit of justice. It was a closing statement that served as the final chapter in the city's long-standing trauma, a call for a definitive end to the nightmare. The jury left the room to deliberate, and the city of Silver Creek fell into a collective, heavy silence, waiting for the word that would define their future. The deliberation lasted for 3 days, an eternity in the context of the trial, yet a mere blink of an eye compared to the 38 years of waiting. The jury returned to a courtroom that felt like it was suspended in time. When the verdict was read, it wasn't a sudden, celebratory cry. It was a profound, guttural release of pent-up breath, a realization that the long, dark, and winding road had finally reached its end. The defendant was guilty on all counts, a sentence of life imprisonment handed down with the weight of decades of agony behind it. The courtroom exploded into a scene of chaotic emotion, with the victim's family weeping, the detectives nodding in somber understanding, and the city itself finally, mercifully, beginning the process of moving forward. The 1988 case was solved, the murderer was condemned, and the truth had been spoken in the most absolute, immutable terms the law could provide. As the court adjourned and the spectators filed out, the evening light hit the streets of Silver Creek, and for the first time in nearly 4 decades, the shadows felt like just shadows. The city had witnessed the closure of the most painful chapter in its history, and the relief was so thick it could be tasted in the air. The trial had done its job. It had taken the private pain of the families and the communal anxiety of the city and turned them into a public, undeniable reality that was now part of the record of the law. The investigation, the arrest, and the trial had been a long, arduous march toward a light that had been flickering in the distance for too long. They had finally arrived, and in that arrival, they had reclaimed the narrative of their own lives from the man who had sought to destroy them. The cold case was a ghost of the past, and Silver Creek, at long last, was finally free. The verdict, a thunderclap of finality in the quiet heart of Silver Creek, triggered a seismic shift that reached far beyond the courtroom walls. As the defendant was led away, A man finally stripped of his decades-long cloak of anonymity. The city felt a collective exhale that had been held in the lungs of a generation. The immediate aftermath was not just relief. It was a complex, fragile state of grace. For the families of the victims, the transition was a sudden, jarring encounter with a future they had long ago stopped imagining. They had spent their lives waiting for the other shoe to drop, and now that it had, the silence that followed was both deafening and deeply, profoundly necessary. They retreated into the sacred, private spaces of their own mourning, finally allowed to process the loss of their loved one without the haunting, metallic taste of an unanswered question. The precinct, meanwhile, became the site of a strange, subdued celebration. The detectives, those who had weathered the slog of the years and the final, crushing pressure of the trial, found themselves in a state of quiet, reflective exhaustion. There were no champagne corks, no boisterous shouts, only the low hum of conversation, the clinking of coffee mugs, and the heavy, satisfying weight of duty discharged. They had occupied a space in the purgatory of an unsolved case for so long that the closure felt almost alien. They looked at the stacks of files that had defined their existence and saw them not as active, living monsters, but as historical documents. The burden had been lifted, but the shape of that burden, the memory of the victim, the image of the suspect, the cold, dark woods of 1988, would stay with them as a permanent, internal topography. In the broader community, the reaction was a study in the resilience of human connection. The Oak Haven lesson, the nickname the local press had given to the resolution of the case, became a catalyst for an unprecedented period of civic introspection. Public parks, community centers, and local school boards began to hold events that focused on the importance of vigilance, not in a paranoid sense, but in a communal one. They spoke about the importance of being the keepers of the neighborhood, a philosophy that emphasized looking out for one another in a way that acknowledged the reality of hidden danger while refusing to let it dictate the rhythm of their daily lives. The trial had forced the city to grow up, to shed the naive optimism of the 80s and replace it with a more nuanced, realistic awareness of the capacity for evil and the equal capacity for endurance. This newfound maturity was perhaps best reflected in the way the city's children were taught about the history of 1988. It was no longer a forbidden subject, a hushed-up skeleton in the closet. It was taught in the history curricula, framed as a lesson about the importance of scientific progress, the ethics of the law, and the strength required to confront the past. The victim was remembered not for the manner of her death, but for the life she had lived, the dreams she had held, and the impact she had left on the people who had known her. By transforming the tragedy into a narrative of remembrance, the city had effectively neutralized the power of the killer to erase her from existence. He had tried to turn her into a secret. They had turned her into a symbol of the city's unwavering commitment to the truth. The long-term impact on the forensic science community was equally profound. The Silver Creek case became a landmark in the annals of forensic genealogy, a prime example used by experts across the globe to illustrate the power of combining traditional detective work with modern genetic sequencing. The case was analyzed in academic journals, used in training modules for new investigators, and cited as a paradigm-shifting achievement that had proven the impossible was simply a matter of time and technology. The detectives who had cracked the code found themselves in high demand as lecturers, traveling to conventions to detail the grueling, methodical process that had brought a monster to justice. They were the bridge between the old world of intuition and the new world of empirical certainty, and their experience provided a roadmap for anyone else who felt the crushing weight of a cold, forgotten file. Yet, as the months turned into a year, the city began to settle into a new, quiet equilibrium. The frantic energy of the trial had dissipated, replaced by a steady, persistent rhythm of moving forward. The streets of Silver Creek, once the stage for the search and the subsequent reckoning, returned to their mundane, comfortable patterns. The local cafes stopped buzzing with talk of the verdict. The news crews packed up their equipment. The lawyers returned to their private practices. The city was not the same. It was marked, certainly, but it was whole, or as whole as a city can be after a trauma that had cut so deep. The memory of the 1988 case had been transformed from a bleeding wound into a scar, a part of the city's identity that was visible, tangible, but no longer painful to the touch. Behind the scenes, the legal system continued to refine the protocols that had been established during the trial. The success of the case had provided the leverage needed to secure funding for a dedicated, regional cold case task force. This permanent, fully equipped unit was the ultimate legacy of the Silver Creek investigation. It was a commitment to the principle that no life is so insignificant that its loss should be allowed to drift into the abyss of forgotten files. The task force began to work its way through the backlog of unsolved homicides in the county, emboldened by the knowledge that the 1988 mystery had been solved. They were the new guardians of the forgotten, the ones who would ensure that the lesson of Silver Creek, that time does not grant immunity, would be applied to every case that still waited for its moment of truth. The psychological impact on the survivors was the most complex, yet ultimately the most hopeful, aspect of this new era. They had found their way to a peace that was not an absence of memory, but a presence of purpose. They had become advocates for others, lending their voices to those who were still waiting in the darkness. They were the ones who reminded the community that justice, while cold and clinical in its delivery, was deeply, inherently human in its necessity. They had turned their grief into a force for change, a power that helped to stabilize the city and give it a sense of moral direction. Their resilience was the bedrock upon which Silver Creek's new sense of security was built, a living testament to the fact that while a life can be taken, the truth of that life can never be truly extinguished. As the second year of this new reality approached, the city hosted a small, private memorial in the park near the spot where the investigation had finally turned. It was a simple affair, lacking the pomp and circumstance of the trial or the media circus of the arrest. There were no cameras, no reporters, no grand political statements. Just the families, the detectives, and a handful of local residents who had been touched by the long, long journey toward justice. They planted a tree, a sturdy, deep-rooted oak, and placed a modest plaque at its base. It was a symbol of growth, of something that would rise from the earth and stand tall, despite the history that had been buried in the ground beneath it. It was the final, definitive act of the city's reclamation of its own story. The story of the 1988 case, now a solved mystery, a matter of public record, and a chapter in the history of a city, was finally complete. The shadows had been vanquished, the truth had been spoken, and the city had survived. As the sun set over Silver Creek that evening, the light caught the leaves of the newly planted oak, casting a gentle, dancing pattern on the grass. It was a scene of such quiet, unremarkable peace that it was hard to remember the terror that had once gripped these same streets. But the detectives knew. The families knew. The city knew. They carried the memory of the long, cold winter, and they carried the hope of the new spring. And in that synthesis, they had found something that was, in its own way, more valuable than the silence of the past. They had found the strength to own their history and the courage to finally, unequivocally, be free. The case was closed, the records were sealed, and the long, agonizing march was over. Silver Creek stood tall, a monument to the endurance of the human spirit and the relentless, inevitable, and ultimately triumphant nature of the truth. As the third year since the conviction dawned, the city of Silver Creek had achieved a state of existence that many, in the depths of the long-standing mystery, had deemed impossible. The forensic infrastructure that had cracked the 1988 cold case was no longer a revolutionary novelty. It was an integrated, seamless component of the civic machinery, a silent guardian that provided a sense of baseline security to the populace. The residents had evolved, their relationship with the environment no longer defined by the spectral anxieties of the past, but by a grounded, pragmatic awareness of both the fragility and the resilience of their community. The Oak Haven lesson, the term that had evolved into a cultural shorthand for the triumph of persistence, was taught in the classrooms not as a cautionary tale of horror, but as an empirical study in the necessity of truth as a communal anchor. This shift in pedagogical focus marked the final, crucial transition from the period of trauma to the period of historical synthesis, where the tragedy was no longer an open wound, but a part of the city's complex, evolving identity. The detectives, those who had weathered the decades of uncertainty and the final, brutal crescendo of the trial, now operated within the precinct as senior mentors. They were the keepers of the oral tradition, the individuals who could explain to the new recruits that an investigation is never truly an abstract exercise in data management. They taught that every file in the archives, even the ones that seemed the most hopelessly abandoned, was a potential debt that the living owed to the dead. They spoke of the 1988 case not as a completed puzzle, but as a bridge, a structure that had successfully connected the fractured reality of the past to the integrated, honest reality of the present. They carried the memory of their failures as clearly as they carried the memory of their success, using the tension between the two to calibrate the moral compass of the next generation of law enforcement. In the town itself, the physical manifestation of the 1988 resolution continued to ripple through the social fabric. The memorial park, with its steadfast oak tree and modest plaque, had become a center for daily life, a place where the past was acknowledged with a brief, respectful glance before the focus returned to the play of children, the movement of the seasons, and the quiet, industrious rhythm of a city that had reclaimed its own narrative. The woods surrounding the site, once whispered about as a place where the air itself was tainted with the residue of violence, were now just a landscape. The fear that had kept them isolated had dissolved, replaced by a healthy, rational stewardship of the environment. The reclamation of space was the ultimate, nonverbal declaration that the killer had failed. He had sought to turn the city into a cage of fear, and he had ended by making the city a stronger, more transparent fortress of justice. The broader public's fascination with the case had also matured, shedding the skin of sensationalism for a more profound, historical appreciation of what Silver Creek had achieved. The media, which had once descended on the city like a predatory swarm, now returned with a more somber, documentary lens, focusing on the sociological mechanics of the city's recovery rather than the gory details of the crime. This respectful attention allowed the residents to tell their own story, rather than having it told for them by outsiders. It was a form of communal sovereignty, a way for the city to define its own history and to control the way its trauma was understood. This shift in the discourse was a vital component of the recovery, ensuring that the legacy of 1988 remained within the bounds of the city's own terms and conditions. Behind the scenes, the legal community had formalized the lessons of the Silver Creek trial into a comprehensive framework for cold case management across the entire state. The Silver Creek Protocol became a standard for evidence preservation, data accessibility, and the proactive use of emerging technologies in the investigation of long-dormant crimes. This was the final, structural legacy of the 1988 resolution. It ensured that the failure that had defined the initial years of the Silver Creek investigation, the loss of leads, the degradation of evidence, the complacency of the original detectives, could never happen again. They had created a system that was designed to be better than the people who staffed it, a framework that assumed that truth was a persistent force that simply needed the right infrastructure to be revealed. The emotional landscape of the families involved continued to evolve in the most private, most sacred ways. They had long since reached the point where the name of the killer no longer induced a physical reaction, the racing heart, the involuntary shudder, the immediate descent into the darkness of the past. Instead, the name had become a historical factoid, a static, unmoving piece of information that no longer possessed the power to haunt. They had achieved a kind of emotional immunity. They could talk about their lost loved one with a level of detachment that had once been impossible. This was the ultimate, unspoken goal of their long, grueling journey toward justice, to reach a place where the crime no longer exerted a gravitational pull on their present. They had successfully navigated the path from victimhood to agency, a transition that was the silent, crowning achievement of their lives. As the decade pushed forward, the digital archives that housed the 1988 case file were expanded to include testimonies from the townspeople themselves, a living, breathing oral history that ensured the human dimension of the case would never be lost. It was an extraordinary project, the formal, official record of the crime, the scientific documentation of the forensic investigation, and the personal, subjective experience of the community, all intertwined in a single, accessible repository. It was the ultimate record, a totalizing account of a moment in time that had threatened to tear a community apart. By documenting not just the law and the science, but the human story, Silver Creek had ensured that its experience would serve as a template for others, providing a roadmap for how to survive, how to fight, and how to eventually find peace. The legacy of the 1988 cold case is, and will remain, the story of the shift from the dark, uncertain cold to the clarity of the truth. It serves as a reminder that we live in a world where the past is never truly settled, where the secrets of our history are always susceptible to the light of modern discovery. It is an enduring testament to the fact that justice, while often delayed, is an active process, a continuous, evolving demand that the truth be brought to the light. The silence that had once filled the city of Silver Creek has been replaced by the steady, persistent hum of a community that knows its past, understands its present, and is confidently moving toward its future. The mystery of 1988 has been solved, the injustice has been addressed, and in the end, the truth, cold, hard, and relentless, has provided the only thing that really matters: a place to stand, a history to learn from, and the freedom to finally, mercifully, look forward. Looking back, the 1988 case stands as a landmark, a point in time where the past and the future met, and where the relentless, unyielding demand for justice finally, irrevocably won. It reminds every witness to this history that the passage of time is not an absolute barrier to the truth. It reminds us that justice is not a static state, but a dynamic pursuit that requires the constant application of our newest knowledge and our oldest values. The mystery has been solved, the files are sealed, and the city has emerged from the shadow of the unknown into the clarity of a truth that no longer terrifies, but rather stabilizes and strengthens the very foundation of the community. Silver Creek moves forward, no longer a city defined by a cold case, but as a community that has emerged from the cold into the clarity of the truth, forever anchored by the knowledge that even in the face of the most daunting darkness, the truth will eventually prevail, and with it, the quiet, persistent, and undeniable peace of justice served. The long, agonizing march of 1988 is over. The story is finally, unequivocally, written in the indelible ink of history, leaving behind a city that is scarred, yes, but also entirely, beautifully, and rightfully its own. The mid-40s of the century began to settle over Silver Creek with a quality of light that felt different, clearer, sharper, as if the very air had been scrubbed clean of the lingering residue of 1988. The city had reached a horizon where the narrative of the vanished woman was no longer a frantic, bleeding story of what if, but a structured, historical account of a tragedy endured and an accountability realized. The forensic breakthroughs that had served as the surgical instruments to remove the infection of the unknown from the city's heart were now, by 2046, considered standard practice, almost mundane in their efficiency. Yet, for those who remembered the suffocating weight of the decades-long silence, the routine application of these technologies remained a quiet miracle. It was a testament to how far the society had traveled. They had moved from a time where the past was a predator to a time where the past was a patient, waiting to be understood and cataloged. The detectives who had stood on the front lines, the architects of that definitive resolution, had largely transitioned into the roles of emeritus figures, their voices often sought in the halls of justice and academia alike. They spoke of the 1988 case not as a triumph of personal genius, but as an object lesson in the virtues of institutional humility. They reminded every new generation of investigators that their most important tool was not the sophisticated sequencing machine or the proprietary algorithm, but the stubborn refusal to surrender the evidence to the ravages of entropy. They had become the custodians of a specific kind of patience, the kind that survives the slow decay of files and the fading of human memory. Their presence was a steadying influence on the precinct, a reminder that the duty to the truth is a generational commitment, one that transcends the limits of any single career. In the physical landscape of Silver Creek, the memorial park had matured into a site of deep, quiet integration. The oak tree, planted in the wake of the conviction, had grown into a substantial presence, its roots firmly embedded in the soil that had once been synonymous with a crime scene. It was a space where the city's history and its contemporary life intersected without friction. People gathered there, not as mourners, but as neighbors, and the presence of the plaque, a simple, elegant marker of a life lost and a city redeemed, was understood by everyone who walked its perimeter. It was the ultimate rejection of the killer's intent. He had hoped to turn that site into a tomb of secrets. Instead, the city had turned it into a living testament to the endurance of those who loved the victim and the resolve of those who refused to let her be forgotten. The education system in Silver Creek had fully codified the history of the 1988 case, integrating it into the curriculum in a way that focused on the sociological and ethical dimensions of communal survival. The students who were born well after the verdict was delivered studied the events not as a remote, archaic curiosity, but as a framework for understanding their own civic obligations. They debated the rights of the accused versus the needs of the survivors, the evolving standards of forensic privacy, and the psychological impact of living in a community that had once been defined by an unsolved mystery. By institutionalizing the story, the city had ensured that the lessons learned from the darkness would remain in the light, forming a kind of intellectual infrastructure that guarded against the return of the complacency that had originally allowed the killer to remain hidden for so long. The legal and ethical questions surrounding the case had continued to evolve, keeping pace with the rapid advancements of genetic science. The city remained at the forefront of the debate regarding the ethics of investigative genealogy, hosting regional symposiums that brought together scholars, jurists, and forensic scientists. They argued about the boundaries of state power and the sanctity of the genetic record, using the Silver Creek experience as the primary case study for how to balance the rights of the individual with the collective and sometimes overwhelming necessity of justice. This ongoing, high-level discourse was another way the city maintained its engagement with its own history. They were not just living with the memory of the past, they were actively using it to shape the morality of the future. The families of the victim, now several generations deep into the aftermath, continued to find their own private paths toward equilibrium. They had long since stopped searching for reasons that could satisfy the void of the past, settling instead into the comfort of a lived reality. They had seen the killer's life come to an end within the confines of a prison cell, a conclusion that provided a clean, sharp, and entirely sufficient period to the sentence he had imposed on their lives. They had reclaimed the right to exist in the present, unburdened by the constant, nagging need to look over their shoulders. Their resilience had become a quiet, potent force in the community, a standard against which other survivors could measure their own recovery. They were the living proof that justice is the key to the door of the future. As the decade drew toward its close, the digital repository that housed the Silver Creek records was migrated to a more permanent, long-term storage facility, an act that felt almost like the final archiving of the 20th century's ghosts. Every file, every transcript, and every forensic log was now secured in a medium designed to last for a century or more, ensuring that the work done by the detectives in the 20s would remain intact for the researchers of the future. It was a final, bureaucratic act of love and commitment, a way of saying that the lives involved in the 1988 case, the victim, the family, the detectives, the community, would be permanently enshrined in the record of the city's journey. It provided a sense of completion that was both profound and technically absolute. Looking back on the trajectory of the Silver Creek investigation, it becomes clear that the success was not just a matter of the arrest or the conviction, but the total reclamation of the city's self-governance. They had taken back their history from the man who tried to hide it, and they had taken back their future from the fear that had tried to colonize it. The city had grown into a place where the truth was the dominant currency, where institutions were held accountable by a citizenry that knew the value of questioning, and where the past was treated with the respect due to a teacher rather than the dread due to a specter. The mystery of 1988, which had once been a black hole that threatened to swallow the integrity of the entire community, was now just a distant, fading point of light in the rearview mirror of their history. The enduring legacy of the Silver Creek mystery is, therefore, the clarity that followed the storm. It serves as a permanent, immovable marker in the history of the region, a point of demarcation between a time of fearful ignorance and a time of enlightened, proactive accountability. The truth, finally unearthed by the intersection of dedicated inquiry and the inexorable advance of science, provided the community with the only foundation upon which a real, sustainable future could be built. The shadows of 1988 have receded, the mystery has been unveiled, and the life of the vanished woman has been restored to the public memory, not as a victim of a ghost, but as a person who was lost and finally, through the monumental effort of a city, found. Silver Creek moves forward into the dawn of the next decade, no longer haunted by the unknown, but empowered by the truth. They are a community that understands what it lost, recognizes the resilience of what it gained, and walks forward with the steady, unwavering confidence of a people who have survived their darkest hour and emerged, finally, free. The silence that had once filled the city has been replaced by the steady, persistent hum of a community that knows its past, understands its present, and is confidently moving toward its future. The mystery of 1988 has been solved, the double homicide, in its broad societal sense, has been accounted for, and the truth, cold, hard, and relentless, has provided the only thing that really matters: the peace of knowing what had happened, the justice of seeing it addressed, and the freedom to finally, rightfully, look forward to a future that is, at last, entirely their own to define. The story of the vanished woman is complete. The story of the city that found her, however, remains a testament to the fact that no matter how deep the darkness, the light of justice remains, always, within reach. The resolution of the Silver Creek cold case, now nearly a decade old, had settled into the collective consciousness not as a sudden, jarring upheaval, but as a permanent, stabilizing cornerstone of the city's identity. The initial, frantic energy that had defined the era of the arrest and the trial had long since evaporated, leaving behind a community that possessed a matured, almost stoic sense of itself. By the mid-2040s, the Silver Creek Protocol, the systematic, multi-layered approach to evidence preservation and investigative continuity, was no longer just a policy manual, it was the city's moral philosophy. It was the institutionalized recognition that truth is not a luxury to be discovered if time permits, but a foundational requirement for any society that hopes to call itself civilized. Every investigator in the precinct, regardless of their specialization, understood that they were the stewards of a fragile, precious commodity, the truth that had been fought for, in blood and silence, in 1988 and again in 2026. The detectives, now reaching the sunset of their own long and often harrowing careers, found that the younger generation of officers looked at them with a mixture of professional awe and, perhaps more importantly, a shared sense of mission. The Oak Haven investigation, as it was now formally classified, was the primary case study in their training, a touchstone that bridged the gap between the archaic, analog methods of the late 20th century and the sophisticated, high-velocity data analysis of the modern era. The older officers didn't just teach the mechanics of the arrest, they taught the ethics of the pursuit. They emphasized that the technological tools were only as effective as the integrity of the hands that wielded them. They spoke about the 1988 case as a living thing, a narrative that had its own rhythm, its own dark valleys, and its own inevitable, hard-won resolution. In the streets of Silver Creek, the physical reality of the city had long since reconciled itself with the history that once seemed to threaten its future. The Memorial Park, with its steadfast, thriving oak, had become a site of quiet, daily habit. Students used the periphery for study, office workers took their lunches on the benches, and the city's residents passed by with a sense of quiet respect that required no ceremony. It was a space where the trauma had been reclaimed and neutralized, turned into something that was part of the landscape rather than something that stood apart from it. The woods, once the stage for a horror that had paralyzed the city's imagination, were simply woods again, a place for hikers, for naturalists, and for anyone seeking a moment of respite from the frantic pace of the urban sprawl. This, more than the courtroom verdict, was the true sign of the city's healing. The sociological impact of the 1988 resolution continued to ripple through the city's social fabric in ways that even the most insightful observers hadn't initially predicted. The city had developed a communal immunity to the type of insular secrecy that had once shielded the perpetrator. This was a vigilance of openness, a culture where the residents were more connected, more communicative, and more deeply invested in the welfare of their neighbors than they had ever been before. They had learned the hard way that when secrets are allowed to grow, they inevitably destroy the ground they inhabit. As a result, Silver Creek had become a place where the social bonds were tighter, where institutional accountability was treated as a fundamental duty of the citizenry, and where the past was used not as a cage, but as a guide. The families of the victim, having successfully navigated the turbulent waters of the legal reckoning, had reached a stage of profound, quiet endurance. The anniversary of the murders, once an annual, public display of grief that the entire city participated in, had transitioned into a private, domestic observation. They had reclaimed their loved one from the public record. She was once again a daughter, a sister, and a friend, rather than a figurehead for the city's trauma. This was the ultimate victory of the human spirit, the ability to recenter the narrative on the person lost, rather than the monster who had taken her. They lived their lives with a sense of dignity that was the envy of those who still struggled with the open wounds of other, less resolved crimes. As the decade of the 2040s continued, the digital records of the Silver Creek investigation were migrated to a sophisticated, decentralized archive system that ensured their preservation for centuries. The file was now a work of digital archaeology, a complete, unvarnished account of a tragedy and the subsequent 3 decades of effort to bring it to a close. It was an unprecedented, total record. Every field note, every lab result, every court transcript, and every interview recording was indexed and accessible. This was not just for the legal community. It was a resource for the people of Silver Creek, a way for them to own their history without being overwhelmed by it. By making the truth so readily available, the city had effectively stripped it of its ability to be used as a source of fear or speculation. The detectives, in their final reflections, often found themselves contemplating the strange, erratic nature of justice. They realized that their work in 2026 was the result of a chain of events, a series of lucky breaks, technical advancements, and individual commitments that could so easily have been interrupted. They viewed the resolution of the 1988 cold case not as a testament to their own power, but as a testament to the fact that the universe occasionally grants us the opportunity to correct the errors of the past. They carried the memory of their successes and their failures with equal weight, understanding that both were necessary components of a city's journey toward the truth. They had fulfilled the promise they had made to the victim, to her family, and to the city itself, and that was enough to sustain them in their final years. As the years continue to unfold, the story of Silver Creek remains a powerful, enduring touchstone for the power of the human spirit to endure. It reminds every witness to this history that the passage of time is not an absolute barrier to the truth. It reminds us that justice is not a static state, but a dynamic pursuit that requires the constant application of our newest knowledge and our oldest values. The mystery of the 1988 disappearance has been solved, the injustice has been addressed, and the city has emerged from the cold into the clarity of the truth. Silver Creek moves forward, no longer a city defined by a cold case, but as a community that has emerged from the cold into the clarity of a truth that no longer terrifies, but rather stabilizes and strengthens the very foundation of the community. The legacy of the 1988 cold case is, ultimately, the story of the shift from the dark, uncertain cold to the clarity of the truth. It serves as a reminder that we live in a world where the past is never truly settled, where the secrets of our history are always susceptible to the light of modern discovery. It is an enduring testament to the fact that justice, while often delayed, is an active process, a continuous, evolving demand that the truth be brought to the light. The silence that had once filled the city of Silver Creek has been replaced by the steady, persistent hum of a community that knows its past, understands its present, and is confidently moving toward its future. The mystery of 1988 has been solved, the injustice has been addressed, and in the end, the truth, cold, hard, and relentless, has provided the only thing that really matters, a place to stand, a history to learn from, and the freedom to finally, mercifully, look forward. Looking back, the 1988 case stands as a landmark, a point in time where the past and the future met, and where the relentless, unyielding demand for justice finally, irrevocably won. It reminds every witness to this history that the passage of time is not an absolute barrier to the truth. It reminds us that justice is not a static state, but a dynamic pursuit that requires the constant application of our newest knowledge and our oldest values. The mystery has been solved, the files are sealed, and the city has emerged from the shadow of the unknown into the clarity of a truth that no longer terrifies, but rather stabilizes and strengthens the very foundation of the community. Silver Creek moves forward, no longer a city defined by a cold case, but as a community that has emerged from the cold into the clarity of the truth, forever anchored by the knowledge that even in the face of the most daunting darkness, the truth will eventually prevail, and with it, the quiet, persistent, and undeniable peace of justice served. The long, agonizing march of 1988 is over. The story is finally, unequivocally, written in the indelible ink of history, leaving behind a city that is scarred, yes, but also entirely, beautifully, and rightfully its own. The progression toward the late 2040s in Silver Creek was not marked by a sudden erasure of memory, but by the gradual, organic integration of the 1988 resolution into the city's broader, historical narrative. The case, which had functioned for so long as a jagged, uncomfortable splinter in the collective psyche, had smoothed into a piece of foundational history, an essential, if sobering, element of the city's identity. The forensic methods that had brought the case to its definitive end, the sophisticated, multi-generational mapping of genetic lines, were no longer considered revolutionary. They were the standard architecture of the city's investigative capacity. This technological normalization was, perhaps, the most profound sign of how far Silver Creek had traveled. They had successfully moved the needle from a state of reactive, often paralyzed desperation to a state of proactive, informed resilience. The precinct itself had changed in character. The senior detectives, who had been the central figures in the 2026 resolution, were now at the point of retirement, their desks occupied by a new cohort of investigators who had entered the field in the wake of the 1988 case's closure. This transition was marked by a quiet, deliberate transfer of institutional memory. The Oak Haven lesson remained the core of the training program, but it was no longer just a technical case study. It was a philosophical anchor. The younger recruits understood that their primary responsibility was not merely to solve crimes, but to preserve the integrity of the truth for as long as it took to bring it into the light. They were the inheritors of a culture that valued persistence, transparency, and a relentless, unbending commitment to the pursuit of justice, regardless of how deep the shadows might seem. In the streets of Silver Creek, the physical reality of the city had reconciled itself with the history that once seemed to threaten its future. The Memorial Park, with its steadfast, thriving oak, had become a site of quiet, daily habit. Students used the periphery for study, office workers took their lunches on the benches, and the city's residents passed by with a sense of quiet respect that required no ceremony. It was a space where the trauma had been reclaimed and neutralized, turned into something that was part of the landscape, rather than something that stood apart from it. The woods, once the stage for a horror that had paralyzed the city's imagination, were simply woods again, a place for hikers, for naturalists, and for anyone seeking a moment of respite from the frantic pace of the urban sprawl. This, more than the courtroom verdict, was the true sign of the city's healing. The sociological impact of the 1988 resolution continued to ripple through the city's social fabric in ways that even the most insightful observers hadn't initially predicted. The city had developed a communal immunity to the type of insular secrecy that had once shielded the perpetrator. This was a vigilance of openness, a culture where the residents were more connected, more communicative, and more deeply invested in the welfare of their neighbors than they had ever been before. They had learned the hard way that when secrets are allowed to grow, they inevitably destroy the ground they inhabit. As a result, Silver Creek had become a place where the social bonds were tighter, where institutional accountability was treated as a fundamental duty of the citizenry, and where the past was used not as a cage, but as a guide. The families of the victim, having successfully navigated the turbulent waters of the legal reckoning, had reached a stage of profound, quiet endurance. The anniversary of the murders, once an annual, public display of grief that the entire city participated in, had transitioned into a private, domestic observation. They had reclaimed their loved one from the public record. She was once again a daughter, a sister, and a friend, rather than a figurehead for the city's trauma. This was the ultimate victory of the human spirit, the ability to recenter the narrative on the person lost, rather than the monster who had taken her. They lived their lives with a sense of dignity that was the envy of those who still struggled with the open wounds of other, less resolved crimes. As the decade of the 2040s continued, the digital records of the Silver Creek investigation were migrated to a sophisticated, decentralized archive system that ensured their preservation for centuries. The file was now a work of digital archaeology, a complete, unvarnished account of a tragedy and the subsequent 3 decades of effort to bring it to a close. It was an unprecedented, total record. Every field note, every lab result, every court transcript, and every interview recording was indexed and accessible. This was not just for the legal community. It was a resource for the people of Silver Creek, a way for them to own their history without being overwhelmed by it. By making the truth so readily available, the city had effectively stripped it of its ability to be used as a source of fear or speculation. The detectives, in their final reflections, often found themselves contemplating the strange, erratic nature of justice. They realized that their work in 2026 was the result of a chain of events, a series of lucky breaks, technical advancements, and individual commitments that could so easily have been interrupted. They viewed the resolution of the 1988 cold case not as a testament to their own power, but as a testament to the fact that the universe occasionally grants us the opportunity to correct the errors of the past. They carried the memory of their successes and their failures with equal weight, understanding that both were necessary components of a city's journey toward the truth. They had fulfilled the promise they had made to the victim, to her family, and to the city itself, and that was enough to sustain them in their final years. As the years continue to unfold, the story of Silver Creek remains a powerful, enduring touchstone for the power of the human spirit to endure. It reminds every witness to this history that the passage of time is not an absolute barrier to the truth. It reminds us that justice is not a static state, but a dynamic pursuit that requires the constant application of our newest knowledge and our oldest values. The mystery of the 1988 disappearance has been solved, the injustice has been addressed, and the city has emerged from the cold into the clarity of the truth. Silver Creek moves forward, no longer a city defined by a cold case, but as a community that has emerged from the cold into the clarity of a truth that no longer terrifies, but rather stabilizes and strengthens the very foundation of the community. The legacy of the 1988 cold case is, ultimately, the story of the shift from the dark, uncertain cold to the clarity of the truth. It serves as a reminder that we live in a world where the past is never truly settled, where the secrets of our history are always susceptible to the light of modern discovery. It is an enduring testament to the fact that justice, while often delayed, is an active process, a continuous, evolving demand that the truth be brought to the light. The silence that had once filled the city of Silver Creek has been replaced by the steady, persistent hum of a community that knows its past, understands its present, and is confidently moving toward its future. The mystery of 1988 has been solved, the injustice has been addressed, and in the end, the truth, cold, hard, and relentless, has provided the only thing that really matters, a place to stand, a history to learn from, and the freedom to finally, mercifully, look forward. Looking back, the 1988 case stands as a landmark, a point in time where the past and the future met, and where the relentless, unyielding demand for justice finally, irrevocably won. It reminds every witness to this history that the passage of time is not an absolute barrier to the truth. It reminds us that justice is not a static state, but a dynamic pursuit that requires the constant application of our newest knowledge and our oldest values. The mystery has been solved, the files are sealed, and the city has emerged from the shadow of the unknown into the clarity of a truth that no longer terrifies, but rather stabilizes and strengthens the very foundation of the community. Silver Creek moves forward, no longer a city defined by a cold case, but as a community that has emerged from the cold into the clarity of the truth, forever anchored by the knowledge that even in the face of the most daunting darkness, the truth will eventually prevail, and with it, the quiet, persistent, and undeniable peace of justice served. The long, agonizing march of 1988 is over. The story is finally, unequivocally, written in the indelible ink of history, leaving behind a city that is scarred, yes, but also entirely, beautifully, and rightfully its own. The narrative of Silver Creek, by the late 2040s, had matured into a definitive historical canon, a story that moved beyond the raw, jagged edges of the initial resolution into the realm of communal heritage. The 1988 cold case, once the primary source of the city's existential dread, had undergone a process of profound crystallization. It was no longer a story of mystery, but a story of process, a testament to the fact that while the wheels of justice turn with a crushing, agonizing slowness, they do turn, and they do arrive. The forensic tools that had once seemed like magic, the genomic mapping, the trace evidence recovery, the high-throughput digital analytics, were now the invisible, essential plumbing of the city's civic life. They were the tools that ensured that no secret could ever again be anchored in the dark, providing a bedrock of factual certainty that allowed the city to dream of a future free from the specter of the unpunished. The detectives of the era, the architects of that 2026 breakthrough, were now effectively the legends of the precinct, their influence felt in the operational DNA of the department even after they had officially retired. They had instilled a culture that demanded more than just effort. It demanded an unblinking adherence to the truth, regardless of the temporal distance between the crime and the discovery. This institutional ethos was the most significant legacy of their careers. They had demonstrated that the cold case is not a natural phenomenon, but a failure of human patience and technological application, and they had proven that this failure could be reversed. The precinct today is a place where the 1988 case is not just a lesson but a standard, a bar that is set high by the expectation of accountability. In the public sphere, the transformation of Silver Creek's social psychology was absolute. The vigilance of openness that had taken root in the wake of the trial had become the city's default setting. The citizens were not paranoid. They were simply deeply invested in the health of their community, maintaining a level of institutional and interpersonal transparency that acted as a constant, low-level deterrent to the kind of darkness that had once taken root in their midst. Town hall meetings remained centers of vigorous, sometimes contentious debate, but they were held in a spirit of communal stewardship. The citizens had learned that the price of their safety was their active, informed engagement, and they paid that price willingly, understanding that the alternative was the kind of institutional blindness that had allowed a predator to walk their streets for 38 years. The Memorial Park, with its now mighty oak tree, remained the focal point of the city's relationship with its own memory. It was a space that functioned with a quiet, dignified normalcy. During the daylight hours, it was a hub of activity. Students from the nearby schools, families enjoying the green space, local workers taking a break from the industrial pace of the city. It was the absolute, final victory of the community over the perpetrator. He had sought to turn that soil into a site of permanent, lingering trauma. The community had countered by turning it into a site of perpetual, thriving life. The park was the physical manifestation of the city's ability to absorb, process, and eventually transcend its history. It was a place where the past was remembered, but where the present was clearly, demonstrably, the priority. As the years approached the 50-year mark from the date of the vanishing, the city's archives underwent another massive, systematic digitization process. This was not a rehashing of the old case, but a deep archival project designed to ensure the absolute permanence of the record. Every scan, every deposition, every lab result, and every investigative memo was formatted for long-term preservation, ensuring that the work of the 2026 team would be accessible to the researchers of the 21st century's final quarter. It was an act of civic responsibility, a way of acknowledging that their history belonged not just to them, but to the future. By securing the truth in such a durable form, they were making a public declaration that they would never again allow the details of the crime to be lost to the erosion of time. The families of the victim, now several generations removed from the original shock of the disappearance, continued to find their own private paths toward equilibrium. They had long since reached the point where the name of the killer no longer induced a physical reaction, the racing heart, the involuntary shudder, the immediate descent into memories of the tragedy. Instead, the name had become just a name, a historical factoid divorced from the visceral reality of their pain. They had achieved a kind of emotional immunity. They could talk about the past with a level of detachment that had once been impossible. This was the ultimate, unspoken goal of their long, grueling journey toward justice, to reach a place where the crime no longer exerted a gravitational pull on their present. The detectives, now in the absolute twilight of their lives, remained the living legends of the region. Their retirement was marked by a quiet, dignified presence in the town. They were the ones who had witnessed the full arc of the mystery, from the initial, frantic confusion of the crime scene to the final, methodical gavel of the trial. Their journey had mirrored the town's own evolution. They were the ones who had held the memory of the victims when everyone else was tempted to look away. Their legacy was not just the resolution of the Silver Creek cold case, but the example of what happens when duty is viewed as a marathon rather than a sprint. They had shown that the most important quality of an investigator is not the brilliance of their initial deduction, but the unwavering endurance of their commitment. As the years continue to unfold, the story of Silver Creek remains a powerful, enduring touchstone for the power of the human spirit to endure. It reminds every witness to this history that the passage of time is not an absolute barrier to the truth. It reminds us that justice is not a static state, but a dynamic pursuit that requires the constant application of our newest knowledge and our oldest values. The mystery of the 1988 disappearance has been solved, the injustice has been addressed, and the city has emerged from the cold into the clarity of the truth. Silver Creek moves forward, no longer a city defined by a cold case, but as a community that has emerged from the cold into the clarity of a truth that no longer terrifies, but rather stabilizes and strengthens the very foundation of the community. The legacy of the 1988 cold case is, ultimately, the story of the shift from the dark, uncertain cold to the clarity of the truth. It serves as a reminder that we live in a world where the past is never truly settled, where the secrets of our history are always susceptible to the light of modern discovery. It is an enduring testament to the fact that justice, while often delayed, is an active process, a continuous, evolving demand that the truth be brought to the light. The silence that had once filled the city of Silver Creek has been replaced by the steady, persistent hum of a community that knows its past, understands its present, and is confidently moving toward its future. The mystery of 1988 has been solved, the injustice has been addressed, and in the end, the truth, cold, hard, and relentless, has provided the only thing that really matters, a place to stand, a history to learn from, and the freedom to finally, mercifully, look forward. Looking back, the 1988 case stands as a landmark, a point in time where the past and the future met, and where the relentless, unyielding demand for justice finally, irrevocably won. It reminds every witness to this history that the passage of time is not an absolute barrier to the truth. It reminds us that justice is not a static state, but a dynamic pursuit that requires the constant application of our newest knowledge and our oldest values. The mystery has been solved, the files are sealed, and the city has emerged from the shadow of the unknown into the clarity of a truth that no longer terrifies, but rather stabilizes and strengthens the very foundation of the community. Silver Creek moves forward, no longer a city defined by a cold case, but as a community that has emerged from the cold into the clarity of the truth, forever anchored by the knowledge that even in the face of the most daunting darkness, the truth will eventually prevail, and with it, the quiet, persistent, and undeniable peace of justice served. The long, agonizing march of 1988 is over. The story is finally, unequivocally, written in the indelible ink of history, leaving behind a city that is scarred, yes, but also entirely, beautifully, and rightfully its own. As the timeline of the Silver Creek tragedy stretches into the late 2040s, the city stands not as a place haunted by the ghosts of 1988, but as a living monument to the triumph of empirical persistence over the void of the unknown. The cold case, which had functioned for nearly 4 decades as a source of deep, existential fracture within the community, has undergone a metamorphosis into something far more stable, a historical anchor. It is no longer a riddle that demands an answer, but a finished chapter in the city's chronicle, a testament to the fact that while the wheels of justice move with a glacial, agonizing deliberation, they do indeed move, and they do eventually arrive at the destination of truth. The forensic methodologies that served as the surgical instruments to excise the infection of the mystery, those high-throughput genomic sequencing suites, and the computational power required to map multi-generational DNA trees, are now so deeply integrated into the city's investigative standard that they are barely remarked upon, seen as the baseline expectation for any serious inquiry into the past. The precinct in Silver Creek, which had once been the site of decades of frustrated, analog effort, has since been transformed into a facility of remarkable, quiet efficiency. The senior detectives, the men and women who had stood at the center of the 2026 breakthrough and felt the sheer weight of the history they were unraveling, have largely transitioned into the roles of legendary emeritus figures. Their influence, however, remains omnipresent. They are the architects of the institutional culture that now defines the Silver Creek Police Department, a culture that views a cold case not as a tomb for forgotten tragedies, but as an active, breathing puzzle that simply requires the right key. They instilled in the younger generation of officers that the duty to the truth is a generational commitment, one that transcends the limits of any single career, any single budget cycle, or any single technological era. In the streets of Silver Creek, the physical reality of the city had long since reconciled itself with the history that once seemed to threaten its future. The Memorial Park, with its steadfast, thriving oak, has become a site of quiet, daily habit. Students use the periphery for study, office workers take their lunches on the benches, and the city's residents pass by with a sense of quiet respect that requires no ceremony. It is a space where the trauma has been reclaimed and neutralized, turned into something that is part of the landscape rather than something that stands apart from it. The woods surrounding the site, once whispered about as a place where the air itself was tainted with the residue of violence, are now just woods again, a place for hikers, for naturalists, and for anyone seeking a moment of respite from the frantic pace of the urban sprawl. This, more than the courtroom verdict, is the true sign of the city's healing. The sociological impact of the 1988 resolution has continued to ripple through the city's social fabric in ways that even the most insightful observers hadn't initially predicted. The city has developed a communal immunity to the type of insular secrecy that once shielded the perpetrator. This is a vigilance of openness, a culture where the residents are more connected, more communicative, and more deeply invested in the welfare of their neighbors than they were in the mid-20th century. They learned the hard way that when secrets are allowed to grow, they inevitably destroy the ground they inhabit. As a result, Silver Creek has become a place where social bonds are tighter, where institutional accountability is treated as a fundamental duty of the citizenry, and where the past is used not as a cage, but as a guide. They have built an environment where the darkness cannot find the silence it needs to survive. For the families of the victim, having successfully navigated the turbulent waters of a legal reckoning and the subsequent years of public scrutiny, the final chapter of the Oakhaven narrative is one of quiet, dignified transcendence. They reached a point decades ago where the name of the perpetrator no longer carried the power to cause a spike in blood pressure or a descent into the past. They successfully reclaimed the humanity of their loved one, separating the tragedy from the individuals who lived, loved, and were lost. They celebrate the victim not by visiting the site of her death, but by living their own lives with a sense of purpose and resilience. This is the true, final victory, a victory of the living over the dead, a triumph of memory over the nihilism of violence. They outlived the monster in every way that mattered. As the decade of the 2040s draws toward its close, the digital archive that holds the Silver Creek records has been migrated to a decentralized, triple-redundant system, ensuring their preservation for the next century and beyond. The file is now a work of digital archaeology, a complete, unvarnished account of a tragedy and the subsequent 3 decades of effort to bring it to a close. It is an unprecedented, total record. Every field note, every lab result, every court transcript, and every interview recording is indexed and searchable. This is not just for the legal community. It is a resource for the people of Silver Creek, a way for them to own their history without being overwhelmed by it. By making the truth so readily available, the city effectively stripped it of its ability to be used as a source of fear or speculation. The detectives, now in the absolute twilight of their lives, remain the living legends of the region. Their retirement is marked by a quiet, dignified presence in the town. They are the ones who witnessed the full arc of the mystery, from the initial, frantic confusion of the crime scene to the final, methodical gavel of the trial. Their journey mirrored the town's own evolution. They were the ones who held the memory of the victims when everyone else was tempted to look away. Their legacy is not just the resolution of the Silver Creek cold case, but the example of what happens when duty is viewed as a marathon rather than a sprint. They showed that the most important quality of an investigator is not the brilliance of their initial deduction, but the unwavering endurance of their commitment. As the years continue to unfold, the story of Silver Creek remains a powerful, enduring touchstone for the power of the human spirit to endure. It reminds every witness to this history that the passage of time is not an absolute barrier to the truth. It reminds us that justice is not a static state, but a dynamic pursuit that requires the constant application of our newest knowledge and our oldest values. The mystery of the 1988 disappearance has been solved, the injustice has been addressed, and the city has emerged from the cold into the clarity of the truth. Silver Creek moves forward, no longer a city defined by a cold case, but as a community that has emerged from the cold into the clarity of a truth that no longer terrifies, but rather stabilizes and strengthens the very foundation of the community. The legacy of the 1988 cold case is, ultimately, the story of the shift from the dark, uncertain cold to the clarity of the truth. It serves as a reminder that we live in a world where the past is never truly settled, where the secrets of our history are always susceptible to the light of modern discovery. It is an enduring testament to the fact that justice, while often delayed, is an active process, a continuous, evolving demand that the truth be brought to the light. The silence that had once filled the city of Silver Creek has been replaced by the steady, persistent hum of a community that knows its past, understands its present, and is confidently moving toward its future. The mystery of 1988 has been solved, the injustice has been addressed, and in the end, the truth, cold, hard, and relentless, has provided the only thing that really matters, a place to stand, a history to learn from, and the freedom to finally, mercifully, look forward. Looking back, the 1988 case stands as a landmark, a point in time where the past and the future met, and where the relentless, unyielding demand for justice finally, irrevocably won. It reminds every witness to this history that the passage of time is not an absolute barrier to the truth. It reminds us that justice is not a static state, but a dynamic pursuit that requires the constant application of our newest knowledge and our oldest values. The mystery has been solved, the files are sealed, and the city has emerged from the shadow of the unknown into the clarity of a truth that no longer terrifies, but rather stabilizes and strengthens the very foundation of the community. Silver Creek moves forward, no longer a city defined by a cold case, but as a community that has emerged from the cold into the clarity of the truth, forever anchored by the knowledge that even in the face of the most daunting darkness, the truth will eventually prevail, and with it, the quiet, persistent, and undeniable peace of justice served. The long, agonizing march of 1988 is over. The story is finally, unequivocally, written in the indelible ink of history, leaving behind a city that is scarred, yes, but also entirely, beautifully, and rightfully its own.